All right, we have covered both the Ibis Ripley and the Ripmo in their own videos, so now it's time for the shootout. You might be thinking these bikes aren't really that different because they use the same frame, but you'd be wrong. On paper, the differences are fairly small, but out on the trails in real world applications, the differences between these bikes become very apparent. So let's dive in. Actually, before we dive in, we have these bikes available for purchase on our new e-commerce site. So if you're looking for a Ripley or Ripmo, visit our site, we can help you out. All right, so we basically have one frame, but two different trail bikes here. One is on the shorter travel side and the other is more aggressive with more travel and slacker geometry. With 130 millimeters of travel, the Ripley is a more balanced ride and it's a bit more neutral in its intentions. The Ripmo with 150 millimeters of travel shifts up the Burley scale quite a bit and is more descent biased. It's still a well-rounded bike and I wouldn't go as far as pigeonholing it as an enduro bike. Both bikes can be run in full 29 setups as well as MX configurations. They both feature updated suspension kinematics that offer more traction, more mid-stroke support, and more ramp up at the end of the stroke. Starting with the Ripley, we have a quick rolling, efficient climber with a slightly more forward biased posture. It places equal emphasis on the climbs and descents, and as a result, it feels quite a bit quicker on climbs and rolling terrain. The Ripley doesn't look as XC on paper as the older V4, but I don't really think it suffers all that much on the climbs. The body position still allows for great weight distribution, the suspension is plenty efficient, and the tires are still fast rolling. Really, the only thing you can complain about, and trust me, too damn many of you already have, is the weight. It is a little bit heavier than the previous Ripley, but because of that, you get a stiffer, more robust frame, better durability, and internal frame storage. The suspension platform on the Ripley feels a bit firmer and more supportive, and that's likely due to the nature of the shock just having less stroke to work with. It still provides a pretty decent amount of traction for those technical and loose climbs, but that plushness doesn't extend as deep into the stroke as you'll find on the Ripmo. The Ripmo's suspension allows for even more traction and more control on those bumpy climbs. Of course, the trade-off is a little bit less efficiency than you'll get on the Ripley. The Ripmo scoots up the Burley scale just a bit, and because of it, it pays a couple of penalties on the climbs. Namely, the body position is a bit more rearward, although for the category it's still fairly well balanced. Of course, the Ripmo gets even heavier than the Ripley because of the components it comes with. Most of the components get bigger, burlier, and more robust, but the ones that impact climbing performance the most are the tires and suspension components. The Minion Assegai tires roll significantly slower than the Recons on the Ripley. Clearly, the climbing performance award here goes to the Ripley. It's a no-brainer. Now let's get to the fun stuff, going back down the mountain. Previously, there was a decent overlap between the Ripley and the Ripmo, and I think that gap has been narrowed ever so slightly with the current versions. So let's start with the Ripmo. It's one of those bikes that you could take anywhere, and it's going to be pretty okay. You might find yourself wanting a little bit more or less at times, but for the most part, the bike is going to be evenly matched to just about any trail. The geometry is right where most other brands have been settling in on their 150 mil travel bikes. Plenty slack without going overboard, leading to a stable yet maneuverable and quickish feeling handling. It's fun in the corners and on smoother trails and tighter stuff, but it's not overly timid when you're pushing the pace in fast and rough terrain. The Ripley does feel quite a bit different in terms of handling and geometry. The Ripley gets a bit shorter overall and steeper, and both of those characteristics give it a sportier character than the Ripmo. It doesn't just feel like a compromised Ripmo on the descents. In fact, it offers something that the Ripmo can't, and that's the even livelier handling feel. The suspension feel between the two bikes is pretty different considering they have the same frame. Of course, the linkage and shocks are different, which will give each bike a unique feel. The Ripley is definitely firmer, less forgiving, and a bit tougher to get into. The Ripmo, on the other hand, is softer, easier to use, and plusher. They both fit their respective applications very well. The Ripmo offers more traction and control in the rough and on steep terrain. It hugs the ground significantly better, but conversely, the Ripley is slightly better at holding speed and momentum, especially in rolling and smooth terrain. Of course, that comes at the expense of traction and control on the rougher stuff. The Ripmo felt poppier and easier to get off the ground than the Ripley, which actually was a bit surprising for me. It seemed more willing to get airborne in terms of the suspension feel. The Ripley felt a bit firmer and harder to get into the rear suspension, making it a little bit tougher to get the front wheel off the ground for bunny hopping and unweighting. Picking a winner here is tough because you can't just necessarily say the Ripmo is better because it's more capable. Not everybody needs the more capable descender. So yes, the Ripmo is way more capable than the Ripley, but like I said, the Ripley offers something the Ripmo can't, and that's the really sporty, quick, and lively handling. Personally, I prefer the Ripmo, but I do know a lot of folks who would be much happier on a Ripley. So now let's chat pros and cons of each of these bikes. Smaller riders might actually prefer the Ripmo, as it comes stock in an MX configuration on sizes small and medium, whereas the Ripley is a full 29er on all sizes. Of course, you can convert either bike to either wheel setup, but the Ripmo is the only one that comes as an MX out of the box. For whatever reason, I had a harder time setting up the suspension on the Ripley. I ended up having to remove a volume spacer to really be able to use that travel well. So I would imagine a lot of people who would buy and ride a Ripley are going to experience that same thing where the suspension is a little bit tough to get into and they might have to do a bit more fine tuning on that shock to get it to feel how they like. The biggest pro for me about these bikes, apart from ride quality, is the versatility that they offer. Considering they share a frame, you could potentially build one up somewhere in between the two. You could overbuild a Ripley or slim down a Ripmo for something in the middle. And that kind of versatility is really nice for making your bike ride exactly how you want it to. All right, buyer's guide. Which one should you choose? First of all, they're both trail bikes. Now that the XE and the HD6 exist, the Ripmo and Ripley can now be purpose-built as trail bikes. Previously, the Ripley V4 kind of teetered on that line between XE and trail, but since the launch of the XE, it no longer needs to do that. It can be a trail bike. Same thing with the Ripmo at the other end of the spectrum. The Ripmo used to kind of have to do enduro duty, but now that the HD6 exists, it doesn't need to do that, so it can be purpose-built as a trail bike. And for whatever reason, that seemed to piss a lot of folks off. I don't see why having better, less compromised options is a bad thing. If you want an XC bike, go buy one. If you want an enduro bike, go buy one. If you want a trail bike, now you have two options in the trail category. I'd argue that's way better than having to compromise on either end of that spectrum, having to settle for an X trail or trail duro bike. While I think there is overlap between the two, I still think they're fairly distinct options. The Ripley is much more balanced between uphill and downhill priorities, so it suits the rider who wants to climb and put in some work on the uphills. On the descents, it's great for the rider who only occasionally rides double black diamond terrain, or I guess for the skilled rider who enjoys that sporty and responsive handling even in challenging terrain. It's really ideal though on smoother, mellower single track and for putting in big days. The Ripmo, on the other hand, is happier when it's pointed downhill, a little bit less balanced than the Ripley. That's not to say it can't climb, but it clearly prioritizes descending performance. It offers much more traction and control on the rough and steep stuff, but it still offers quick handling for the category without being too squirrely at speed. It's great for the group of riders who don't ever like feeling outgunned. Whether you're just inclined to ride easy terrain, but you like having some extra comfort and confidence in your bike, or you are that rider riding more difficult terrain and need a bit more bike. It has enough travel to get you through just about anything. So that's going to do it for our Ripley versus Ripmo showdown. Again, these are available to purchase on our website. Go check them out, and we'll see you next time.